Greetings, adventurers. You're listening to The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood with me, Professor Atwood. I'm glad you're here, and I can't wait to tell you about my latest journey. Don't worry, it's a safe space. I'll handle all the danger for you. I designed these stories to help you relax, chill anxiety, and go to sleep. Maybe they'll even put a smile on your face, even if it's a sleepy smile. So please, settle in, relax, and prepare to quietly drift off with me to parts known, unknown, and even some places in between. Comfortable? Very well. Let's get underway. Good evening, adventurers. I hope you're doing well. I also hope you're all cozy and settled in because tonight's story continues with the showdown with Professor P at his fake volcanic island lair. Now, as you remember, I had just rescued Bradley and Dolores from the fake ancient temple ruins on the nefarious Professor P's hidden fake volcanic island lair, and as I had filled them in on everything that was happening, I managed to finally put most of the pieces of Professor P's nefarious puzzle together. We had then made our way back to the fake volcanic lair and headed straight for the submarine dock, where I knew Professor P and his minions would be. I was correct, of course, and the scene was complete mayhem, to say the least. Now, as I said before, the 3 science challenges presented by Professor P were ruses, but with purpose, and I wondered if he actually knew the location of my missing mentor, Professor Sampson, after all. But as I said before, I had to take the chance when accepting his 3 science challenges, but I certainly didn't like being duped into participating in the evil machinations of the Infinite Science Cabal, where I had unwittingly helped Professor P build the Gamkus, or the Green Amphibious Minion Coastal Assault Submarine. He used my own science challenge successes in order to do it, and hacked my own submarine's defenses with my own hacking program to steal the Getty's hybrid WETS propulsion system to power his reckless abomination. I know, that's a bit dramatic, but I had my dander up, so please forgive the use of more colorful language. My ex-wife Julia was in the mix on these endeavors, as was my mysterious ally Chef Chet, who kept sending me cryptic and not-so-cryptic messages in my lunch. I just wasn't sure if during the upcoming chaos they would both either be assisting us or be needing assistance themselves. I figured I would find out soon enough. While I could see Julia next to Professor P, it also looked like she was struggling with something internally, but I had a pretty good idea as to what it was at that point. Chef Chet, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found, and that concerned me. I was hoping he hadn't been discovered and captured. After Professor P did some gloating, the battle was joined. I activated my custom umbrella number 6, my force field umbrella, and the minions just bounced off it like tennis balls. Dolores, however, needed no such protection, and tore through those minions like a scissors through paper with her martial arts training. But she was about to meet her match with Professor Roughhouse, who had confronted her. And I will tell you all about this chaotic battle against Professor P and his minions in the Infinite Science Cabal's fake volcanic lair in a moment. But first, I want to talk to you about a few things. First of all, we want to thank you again for all your support and for being here and listening to our stories. It's much appreciated, and we are also warmed by all the wonderful and supportive reviews you've been posting, so thank you. Also, there are 2 types of shows in the podcast high-speed show feed. There are the regular episodes, such as what you're listening to right now, and Professor Atwood's Sleepscapes, to give you more adventures per month. These sleepscapes are pulled directly from my adventures with all the music and sounds we collect on our journeys. We then remix and remaster them and make them longer, so you can create your own adventure in your mind as you settle in and drift off to sleep. And as always, don't forget to rate and review the show, and maybe post about the show, as that's how other adventurers find us. And if you want more info, merchandise, and donation and ad-free Patreon subscription options, where you can also get some bonus content in my regular journals, you can also go to whitecatentertainment.com. All right, let's get back to the story. The battle was joined with Dolores the Mercenary against Professor Roughhouse, and my force field umbrella against the not-so-bright minions who continued to rush me and bounce off it. I was worried we were both running out of energy, and thus running out of time. It was concerning. As the hapless minions continued to bounce off my custom umbrella number 6's force field, Bradley and I were safely protected inside. But for how long? The umbrella battery wouldn't last much longer. I turned my attention to the match between Dolores and Professor Roughhouse. It looked like they were evenly matched as the punches and kicks flew. Dolores was much more elegant in her martial arts, whereas Professor Roughhouse was just a brawler, which of course surprised no one, least of all Dolores. However, something interesting happened then. Professor P held up his hand. He was suddenly intrigued by Dolores' fighting skills. The minions, Dapper Science John, and even Julia, all stopped and started watching the fight between Dolores and Professor Roughhouse. They now had a captive audience for their fight, and I'll admit some more captive than others. Professor Roughhouse smiled as he seemed to like to put on a show. Dolores, however, didn't care. She was all business and took her martial arts very seriously. It was one-on-one, gladiator style. It reminded me of the gladiator combat of ancient Rome. As I'm sure you know, a gladiator was an armed combatant who entertained audiences in the Roman Republic and Roman Empire in violent confrontations with other gladiators, wild animals, and condemned criminals. Some gladiators were even volunteers who risked their lives and their legal and social standing by appearing in the arena. Now, irrespective of their origin, gladiators offered spectators an example of Rome's martial ethics, and in fighting or dying well, they could inspire admiration and popular acclaim. They were celebrated in high and low art, and their value as entertainers was commemorated in precious and commonplace objects throughout the Roman world, like coins and pottery. Yeah, that's right, you could have a commemorative gladiator coin back then. Although, maybe you still can get one, but you'll have to check the internet. Now, the origin of gladiatorial combat is open to debate. There is evidence of it in funeral rites during the Punic Wars of the 3rd century BC, and thereafter it rapidly became an essential feature of politics and social life in the Roman world. Its popularity led to its use in ever more lavish and costly games. The gladiator games lasted for nearly 1,000 years, reaching their peak between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century AD. In 2016 BC, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, late consul and augur, was honored by his sons with 3 days of Munera Gladiatoria in the Forum Romanum, using 22 pairs of gladiators. 10 years later, Scipio Africanus gave a commemorative munus in Iberia for his father and uncle, casualties in the Punic Wars. High-status non-Romans, and possibly Romans too, volunteered as his gladiators. The context of the Punic Wars and Rome's near-disastrous defeat at the Battle of Cannae in 2016 BC link these early games to munificence, the celebration of military victory and the religious expiation of military disaster. These munera appear to serve a morale-raising agenda in an era of military threat and expansion. The next recorded munus, held for the funeral of Publius Licinius in 183 BC, was even more extravagant. It involved 3 days of funeral games, 120 gladiators, and the public distribution of, meat, a practice that reflected the gladiatorial fights at Campanian banquets, although the practice was later scorned by Silius Italicus. Yes, also a real name. What's not quite as well known is how gladiator games were essentially a big business for their time. gladiatorial games offered their sponsors extravagantly expensive but effective opportunities for self-promotion and gave their clients and potential voters exciting entertainment at little or no cost to themselves. Gladiators became big business for trainers and owners, for politicians on the make, and those who had reached the top and wished to stay there. A politically ambitious private citizen might postpone his deceased father's munus to the election season, when a generous show might drum up votes. Those in power and those seeking it needed the support of the plebeians and their tribunes, whose votes might be won with the mere promise of an exceptionally good show. Now, thank goodness none of that happens today, and voters are much more savvy. Anyway, in the closing years of the politically and socially unstable late Republic, any aristocratic owners of gladiators had political muscle at his disposal. In 65 BC, newly elected Julius Caesar held games that he justified as munus to his father, who had been dead for 20 years. Despite an already enormous personal debt, he used 320 gladiator pairs in silver armor. He had more available in Capua, but the Senate, mindful of the recent Spartacus revolt and fearful of Caesar's burgeoning private armies and rising popularity, imposed a limit of 320 pairs as the maximum number of gladiators any citizen could keep in Rome. Caesar's showmanship was unprecedented in scale and expense. He had staged a munus as memorial rather than funeral rite, eroding any practical or meaningful distinction between munus and ludi. Gladiatorial games, usually linked with beast shows, spread throughout the Republic and beyond. Anti-corruption laws of 65 and 63 BC attempted but failed to curb the political usefulness of the games to their sponsors. Following Caesar's assassination and the Roman Civil War, Augustus assumed imperial authority over the games, including Munera, and formalized their provision as a civic and religious duty. His revision of sumptuary law capped private and public expenditures on Munera, claiming to save the Roman elite from the bankruptcies they would otherwise suffer, and restricting gladiator Munera to the festivals of Saturnalia and Quinquatralia. So even gladiator games were, at the end of the day, quite political. But back to our combat at hand between mercenary Dolores and Professor Roughhouse. Each combatant bobbed and weaved, with Dolores being the more elegant fighter, and Professor Roughhouse just charging and swinging. But he could take a punch, and didn't care how dirty his lab coat became. They went back and forth, exchanging blows, but neither gained the upper hand. This went back and forth for a while, but then eventually, Professor Roughhouse became overconfident. He tried a jab and a combo, and Dolores blocked it and countered with a roundhouse kick that knocked him flat. We cheered, but no one else did. Professor P's smile faded, and he once again told his minions to seize us. Unfortunately, this time it was no use. Despite Dolores' combat skills, she was now exhausted from her fight with Professor Roughhouse, and my custom umbrella number 6, the force field umbrella, was almost out of charge. It was only really meant for emergencies, not really for prolonged combat. For that, well, I would have needed a bigger umbrella. We were outnumbered, exhausted, and about to be overwhelmed by minions. My umbrella was weakening, and the force field started to flicker. I would lose it completely soon. But I was hoping one more wheel I had set in motion would indeed start turning. But we were out of time, so I was beginning to become a bit concerned. Things indeed looked dire. The minions were closing in. But in that last moment, that final wheel I had set in motion started turning, just in the nick of time. The sound of running feet reached my ears, and a moment later Chef Chet appeared through the utilidor with a squad of ISP, International Science Police, officers. They were fresh, ready for action, and jumped into the fray without hesitation. They immediately engaged the minions, who were no match for them. Even Professor Roughhouse, who had recovered, but was avoiding Dolores, knew there was no sense in continuing now. The ISP officers swarmed in and subdued the minions without much effort, and even removed Dapper Science John from the winch controls, just as my WET's propulsion system was about to be lowered into the Gamkes. Professor P let out a defeated, frustrated "No!" as he knew he was beaten. Chef Chet directed the officers, and Professor P, the minions, Dapper Science John, and Professor Roughhouse were soon all in custody. We smiled and cheered. It was when Chef Chet flashed his badge I knew the last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. He wasn't just an informant. He was a high-ranking undercover agent for the International Science Police. In addition to being a great chef, he approached me. "I received your note, Professor Atwood. I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner. I needed to stop and pick up the ISP emergency surgeon." I shook his hand vigorously and thanked him for his help, at great risk to himself. He smiled and nodded, saying it was all part of the job. I then rushed up to my wife, Julia, who was staggering and having trouble focusing, which was understandable, as her chip was no longer receiving instructions. I caught her and helped her stand. You see, with Professor P in custody, the ISP had also set up a brain transmission dampening field around the perimeter. She was disoriented, and I said that was normal, and I asked her to please go with the ISP surgeon. The fake volcanic evil science lair of course had a medical bay, and the ISP surgeon would use it immediately. I gently moved her hair out of the way on a side she doesn't normally like pulled back, and underneath her lovely hair was the expected scar of variable length. Professor P had made progress on his studies of neuromorphic engineering in my control chips, but he still couldn't hide the scar completely. I suspected it was there, covered and hidden. Why? Because I knew my ex-wife. When I became suspicious of her actions, combined with the knowledge of how she always likes to wear her hair, I knew something was off. Still, her affection for me shone through, and she truly did want to make things easier for me as much as her implant allowed. I could tell she could fight it sometimes, and sometimes she couldn't. This explained why we could have dinner together, but she was only able to help me or fight the mind-controlled chip's programming so much. The disorientation on my wife's face faded a bit as she regained more of her mental faculties. We hugged tight. She apologized, and I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She smiled again, this time a completely sincere one. She steadied herself and then went with the ISP surgeon. They would remove the chip immediately. Some of the medical bay minions offered to help for a reduced henchman sentence, but the ISP surgeon politely but firmly declined and said he had it under control, to my relief. I took a deep breath and smiled at Dolores and Bradley. Things had dramatically improved. Everything was now under control for the first time since I got to this fake volcanic island lair, and it felt good. But there was still some unfinished business, of course. I walked up to Professor P and confronted him. He was flanked by ISP officers who had him in elaborate science villain handcuffs, not taking any chances. I said, "Professor P, I have successfully completed your 3 science challenges, despite your interference, kidnappings, ruses, and obfuscations. And according to the rules and bylaws of the Evil Science Villain Science Challenges, you are obligated to give me what was promised. In this case, the location of my missing mentor, Professor Sampson." Professor P smiled that annoying smile again and agreed I was correct, that he did indeed abide by and honor the rules of all Science Villain Science Challenges, as he didn't want to be sanctioned by the Evil Science Villain Science Council, who could be, not surprisingly, inflexible. But I didn't like that final smile. He had one last trick up his sleeve. He said that while he was indeed obligated to provide the reward promised for successful completion of evil science challenges, he said in the bylaws there was also a clause that allowed for a bonus surprise challenge of any discipline. The criteria of that bonus surprise challenge was that it had to be a verbal challenge and contain only one question. The downside was that failure in the bonus challenge negated success in the first 3. It wasn't fair, obviously, but evil science challenges rarely are. Professor P said he was going to take full advantage of this bonus surprise challenge clause. Was I ready? He asked. I replied yes, although I'll admit this could go anywhere, so I wasn't even sure how to prepare for it, even if I had the time to, which I didn't. Professor P took a deep breath and said my final bonus challenge was to, and this is where he paused dramatically and then continued, well, after a pause that was much too long, even for dramatic effect. He said, "Say my name." He continued, "Say my full name without laughing. If you can do that, I will tell you where Professor Sampson is." This was unexpected, to say the least, and also quite insidious. He knew no one could say his name without laughing. I took a deep breath. It was probably my most difficult challenge. I had to say his last name, Papadoodle, without laughing. But there was more. I knew there was another twist in there somewhere, as Professor P was as slippery as an eel in a vat of axle grease. I thought for a moment, and then I had it. I took another deep breath and steeled myself and thought about things like climate change and insurance companies to keep myself from smiling. I took another deep breath, and then I said it. Your name is Dr. Ignatius Pomegranate Papadoodle. I gritted my teeth and continued to steel myself. The members of the International Science Police were trying to stifle giggles, but I didn't break. I stared him right in the face, which was also incredibly difficult because he also had a very stupid face. I apologize, that was base and uncalled for, but Professor P really was excellent at pushing my buttons, unfortunately. And at this point, he had pushed the last one. Anyway, I added as a bit of an explanation as to my choice when reciting his full name. I said doctor instead of professor because you never taught at a university, and your parents loved pomegranates. He looked at me, satisfied with the answer. He conceded and added that teaching or mentoring never really interested him, and he wasn't overly fond of pomegranates. Professor P then melted in true defeat this time. You are a worthy opponent, he said. I will tell you where Professor Sampson, your mentor, is. He leaned over and whispered it into my ear, and when he did, I couldn't believe it. I had always suspected, and it was somewhere I had already searched. But Professor P was not only giving me a location, but conditions on finding him. He said Professor Sampson had been lost doing experiments in the Bermuda Triangle, but could only be found when certain search conditions and parameters were met. He then handed me a thumb drive and told me all the relevant data was on there. I honestly didn't know what to say. I didn't think he would be somewhere I had already searched, and thought he would be somewhere I had overlooked. But it made sense. This was why no one had found him. They had already looked in the correct area, but hadn't set the correct parameters. The where was covered, but not the how, until now. Professor P had kept his word. But that doesn't mean I felt at all sorry for him as the ISP led him away. But there was more to be done here, and I had to make sure Julia was safe and recovered after her surgery. Chet came up to me and said not to worry about the evil lair cleanup. He and the ISP had a plan, and it was under control. I was so glad to hear it. After things being controlled for so long by Professor P, it was nice to have things going in the right direction again, from finding the location of Professor Sampson to stopping various coastal invasions by hovering assault minions. And I will tell you all about my ex-wife's recovery, the status of the fake volcanic island, and the beginning of the search for Professor Sampson next time. But before I end this evening's story, I want to talk to you about something. Victory. When you have a victory in your life, it's not random. It's well-earned. You've fought hard, worked hard, and put in your time and energy. Victories are always well-deserved, but we don't always savor that moment. Victory is more than just a win. It's when hard work, effort, planning, and perseverance all pay off at once. So whether you're passing the bar exam or stopping your evil science villain nemesis, it's a victory because of you and the time and effort you've put in. You've earned it, so enjoy the moment. And an earned victory will also give you even more confidence for the upcoming inevitable victories to come. Well done on fighting your battles and achieving your victories, adventurers. Good night.
The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood was created, written, and performed by Chris Mancini and produced by White Cat Entertainment. It is a work of fiction. Maybe. Music and sound design by Ron Tansky at rontanskymusic.com. For more info and merchandise, including t-shirts, mugs, and blankets, go to whitecatentertainment.com.